Good evening, everybody. I can't believe it's been a year. And thinking about that last year, I'm afraid my reading of what's happened since then possibly is not as optimistic, as positive as Sarah's. We all know the phrase, I suspect, for evil to triumph. Maybe I should say, for dictators to act with impunity. Well, you just need good men and women to do nothing, to look away. Or indeed, powerful men to shake the hand of the man who gave the order. I don't think the murder of Jamal really reveals much about Saudi Arabia. That's not really breaking news for any of us in here. I think what it reveals is the reaction, or lack of reaction, from what we call the so-called great democracies of the West. MBS and his henchmen calculated if the murder of Jamal would have consequences, obviously. The decision to silence him, I'm sure they weighed up very carefully with any kind of backlash. This was a journalist that was no longer an insider within Saudi Arabia, was no longer speaking on behalf of Saudi Arabia, was working for the Washington Post, one of the most respected newspapers in the US, the newspaper that broke the Watergate scandal. So the Saudis had to be sure that there would be no fallout from the Allies. Now, of course, the first place that Donald Trump went when he got elected wasn't Mexico or Canada, which is generally where the American presidents visit first time around. It was Saudi Arabia. He was welcomed there like some sort of royal with fantastic pomp and ceremony and a red carpet. And really, I think MBS knew at that point that this was going to be a fantastic administration for him to do business with. And of course, Jamal actually talked about that. He wrote about how this had empowered MBS, his relationship with Trump. And MBS calculated right, because in the end, what was Trump's reaction? He didn't just turn a blind eye, he turned both blind eyes. The CIA investigation, which said there's no way this happened without MBS being aware or involved. The UN report, premeditated extrajudicial execution for which the state of Saudi Arabia is responsible. Trump ignored the calls by Congress to send the CIA intelligence report to them. He didn't take any notice of the UN report either. I mean, the very same month that the UN released its report, Trump turned around and said, MBS is a friend of mine. He's doing a spectacular job. And what about this great democracy we're sitting in? Well, Theresa May turned around she turned around at the time and said there must be robust talks with MBS. There must be some accountability. I'm sure Saudi were quaking in their boots hearing Theresa's comments. I did an investigation for the Channel 4 Dispatches programme earlier this year. We all know that the Brits sell Saudi stacks and stacks of weapons at great expense and great wealth coming this way to the likes of BAE Systems. The investigation we did looked into not the weapons, but the personnel on the ground in Saudi, of which there are thousands of Britons. And the whistleblowers who worked for those contractors, BAE Systems and others, told us that the foreigners, the Brits, were doing 95% of the air campaign on Yemen. That's the bombing of hospitals and mosques and schools. That's British personnel, hundreds actually of military, but thousands of military that have taken off the uniform and put on a suit and are now contractors. We were told by a whistleblower that within 2 weeks, if the Brits pulled out, there would be not a plane in the sky in our investigation. Of course, in the weeks after Jamal was murdered, the UK government approved more arms sales of £11.4 million. So jobs, huge arms sales. In the end, this isn't going to be something that the British government's going to stand up and shout about. Freedom of the press, of speech, in fact, commitment to human rights is a luxury our democracies are increasingly finding they just can't afford. So what is it Saudi Arabia was so afraid of when it came to Jamal? As we've heard so eloquently, he wasn't a hellraiser. He was an insider to start with, but he was somebody that spoke truth. He wasn't an activist in the Arab uprisings, who they all knew that could well get a beating or a bullet. But he did think that it pointed to a new dawn, that the Arab uprisings was a start of the Arab nations finding a voice. But he didn't join in. He was a mediator that wanted the best for Saudi Arabia. He welcomed the reforms. But he didn't welcome the crackdown. He didn't welcome the fact that women activists who were calling for driving were demonized. He wanted breathing space, those were his words, for all opinions. And he wanted the Saudi society to evolve. He wanted people to debate and to listen. Instead, as he put it, it was a state-run narrative dominated the public psyche. His truth was inconvenient. It scared his oppressors. It scared their absolute authority. Again, as he put it, Saudi Arabia wasn't always this repressive, but now it's unbearable. Those kind of words scared MBS. They scared the authority. It's the same kind of truth that scares Donald Trump. His claims of fake news, or even just insignificant news. It's the same kind of words. On the 23rd of June 2014, after 30 years working in this industry, I was convicted of terrorism. I, of course, wasn't in jail. I was convicted in absentia, but my colleagues were rounded up, and they were put in a cage. They were journalists and were treated like terrorists. They were put in solitary confinement. 2 of them were put in a maximum security prison. For what? They had a pen or a camera, not an RPG. They were punished because the Egyptian government didn't like our truth. The Egyptian government hadn't written it themselves. The US Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, under Obama, had gone to Cairo the day before our verdict was announced, and he'd been given quiet assurances that it would be not guilty. And in fact, he'd given a press conference the day before the trial ended, where he said he believed that Egypt is on the roadmap to democracy. Apparently, when he heard the verdict, you could hear his anger from one end of the US embassy to the next. And actually, the year after our guys were thrown in prison, the Obama administration did step up. Every time they met Egyptian officials, they said, you must release the guys, you must get them out of prison. That was, until it was described to me by one of the inner court of John Kerry, ISIS sucked the oxygen out of the room. What he meant by that was, then the US needed Egypt. No longer was the free press, was freedom of speech as important as security. At that point, we were a luxury they couldn't afford or they wouldn't afford. Of course, my colleagues were eventually released. No thanks to this man. Eventually, he was pressurised so much, we think, a large part due to a media campaign from right across the world that shouted to Sisi, you've got to release these journalists. And it did damage to the tourism industry. And of course, when it comes down to it, it's all about money. So they were released. We made enough noise. But I am still a convicted terrorist. I kind of see it as an occupational hazard, really, because I'm certainly not alone. And a year in an Egyptian prison would have been much more damaging, I'm sure. We've tried to get our convictions overturned since they happened. But in spite of campaigns, it's not going to happen. In fact, what's happening in Egypt is getting even worse. As I'm sure you know, There was a demonstration a couple of weeks ago where hundreds took to the streets. Since then, 2,000 have been arrested, rounded up and arrested. Because again, the Egyptian government doesn't want any of their truth being heard. And included in there are more journalists. Of course, it's easier to really get some sort of justice for foreign correspondents. Just in the last week, we heard of a New York Times journalist, Declan Walsh, who was about to be arrested in Egypt. And the Trump administration heard about this, but didn't tell the New York Times. The only reason the New York Times heard was because an Egyptian official leaked it. And Declan managed to get in a very fast car, get to the airport, and get the next plane out. The publisher of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, said these brutal crackdowns are being passively accepted and perhaps even tacitly encouraged by the President of the United States. So what of those following in Jamal's footsteps? They're not foreign correspondents who can jump on a plane and get out of there. The journalists, the commentators, the activists, the human rights activists, the academics, those that try and help their own country, either still in that country or from afar. How do we help them? In the end, we have to be the watchdog. We journalists have to be looking out for each other, because I don't trust the democracies of this world to do it for us. This is a picture of journalists who've been killed. It's a dangerous job nowadays. So, when I look back and think about the loss of Jamal, a huge loss to my profession, a loss to the understanding of the region, of the Gulf and of Saudi Arabia, of course. His measured commentary and careful editorial skills, that's a huge loss too. But it's also put us all on notice that when we are silenced, crushed like he was, it's everybody else who loses their eyes and ears. And I said this a year ago, and I make no apologies for saying it again. First they came for the journalists. We've no idea what happened after that. Thank you.